Was the world created by God? Was it created in 7 literal days? The church clearly teaches that the world was literally created by God, but it also teaches that it was not done in 7 literal days. In other words, the story of creation is not 100% literal, but it also is not 100% mythological. Personally, I would say the creation account is likely 80 to 90% mythological. On the other hand, we have the resurrection story of Jesus. The fact of Jesus' resurrection is 100% literal. But what about the stories that we have about exactly what happened in Jerusalem on that first Easter morning? Well, the problem is that these stories sometimes contain contradictions.
Where did the disciples see the resurrected Jesus in Matthew? It's very simple in Matthew. Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene and tells her to go tell the disciples to go to Galilee and meet him there. Galilee, so if you go from, say this is taking place in Jerusalem, so from Jerusalem to Capernaum is about 80 miles. Okay, so say about a 4-day walk. And then think about Luke for a second. Where did the disciples see the resurrected Jesus in Luke 24? He appears to them for 40 days, proving to them that he's been raised from the dead, and then he ascends to heaven right outside of Jerusalem. He ascends to heaven. They remain in Jerusalem until later, chapters later, they get driven out of Jerusalem by the persecution that arises. Okay. In Matthew's gospel, they leave Jerusalem right away to go to Galilee. That's where they meet Jesus. And in Luke, they do not leave Jerusalem ever until long after his ascension. So which is it? You can't say, well, they stayed in Jerusalem, then they left for a few days and came back. No, they're told to stay and they stay. Or do they go to Galilee? There are very good reasons for this contradiction. You can think of, there are good reasons for it. I mean, there were reasons that Matthew wanted to say one thing and Luke wanted to say another thing. But my point is, they say opposite things.
You see, when we look at all of the accounts, they can't all be 100% literally true because there are contradictions. However, I would say that the stories of the resurrection in the New Testament are 95% literal, but they are still stories people were telling about a literal event. Here's the issue. If a story is authentically an ancient history, we should not expect it to be 100% literal. Ancient peoples did not do history like we do history today. They told stories about the past, and these stories, while normally based in actual events, were not primarily about perfect historical accuracy. In other words, authentic ancient histories fall somewhere on a scale between 100% myth and 100% literal. Each book of Scripture, and even each story within that book of Scripture, should be thought of individually as falling somewhere on this scale. Personally, I think of the story of Balaam's talking donkey or the story of Job as being somewhere more on the mythological end of the scale, while I think of the resurrection or Lehi's journey to be more on the literal side of the scale. Often people get caught up in the binary where they think that a story is either 100% myth or 100% literal. And that simply is not true. But doesn't this cheapen Scripture? I mean, after all, if a myth isn't literal, then it's not true, right?
And you take a work of fiction like Hamlet and you think, well, is that, it's not true because it's fiction. But then you think, wait a minute, what kind of explanation is that? Like maybe it's more true than nonfiction because it takes the story that needs to be told about you and the story that needs to be told about you and you and you and you and abstracts that out and says, look, here's something that's a key part of the human experience as such, right? So it's an abstraction from this underlying noisy substrate and people are affected by it because they see that the thing that's represented is part of the pattern of their being. That's the right way to think about it.
Now, I don't want people to take this too far. If certain events, like the resurrection, did not literally happen, then, as Paul said, our faith is in vain. Historicity does matter. But the great paradox is that if our scriptures are indeed historical and ancient, then we must expect them to make use of inspired storytelling and myth-making as well, as this is how ancient people conveyed information and lessons to each other. I often say that I believe the Bible and the Book of Mormon to be largely mythologized history. In other words, that they are mostly based in real history that 100% happened, but they are stories told about these historical events that are meant to convey a deeper meaning. God is not just listing historical facts. He is teaching us about the spiritual truths that undergird reality itself. He is telling us stories that are always true in a deep sense, archetypal stories that are meant to orient us morally and spiritually back towards Him in the way that we live and are in this world. So while there is a robust discussion to have about where any given story falls on the scale between the literal and the mythological, I hope we as saints are careful not to let certain assumptions cause us to limit the ways in which God can convey His truth through the art of ancient storytelling, while also avoiding the danger of slipping into a worldview that sees the scripture as nothing more than fantasy. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.